In the dead of night at Buckingham Palace, when the corridors are meant to be silent and the monarchy appears most untouchable, a quiet panic is said to be spreading behind closed doors. This is not the panic of scandal tabloids or public outrage. This is something far more dangerous. A fracture from within. Sources claim Princess Anne, long known as the iron spine of the royal family, has done something almost unthinkable. She has pleaded for help, not from the public, not from Parliament, but from those closest to the crown, as the institution she has spent her life defending begins to tremble. At the center of this storm stands King Charles, a monarch already weakened by health concerns and political pressure, now reportedly preparing legal action against his own wife. Allegations of betrayal have crossed a line that can no longer be managed with silence or carefully worded palace statements. What was once whispered as private marital strain has allegedly evolved into something far more explosive, a battle that risks dragging the monarchy itself into open confrontation. And then there is Camilla, a queen consort whose rise was forged through decades of controversy, once patient, once protected, now accused of actions that some insiders describe as a direct threat to the stability of the crown. If these claims are true, this is no longer a personal conflict. It is a constitutional crisis hiding in plain sight. Princess Anne is said to understand this better than anyone. Her reported plea is not emotional. It is strategic. A warning that if the wrong move is made, the damage could be irreversible. Titles, loyalties, even the future line of authority may be at stake. So here is the question that divides even those closest to the throne. Do you believe Princess Anne is trying to save the monarchy at all costs? Or is she fighting to stop a betrayal that has already gone too far? Comment 1 if you think this is about protecting the crown. Comment 2 if you believe the betrayal is real and unstoppable. Princess Anne, long known as the most unshakable pillar of the royal family, found herself at the center of a storm she could no longer contain alone. Those closest to her noticed the change immediately. Her movements were sharper, her words more deliberate, her calm edged with something unmistakably urgent. This was not the composed figure the public associated with endless duties and tireless service. This was a woman pressed into a corner by forces larger than pride or personal conflict. Anne was acting not out of emotion, but out of necessity. Behind closed doors, she reached out to senior palace authorities and a select circle of trusted insiders, delivering a message that carried the weight of alarm. It was not a public appeal, nor a dramatic outburst. It was a measured but desperate plea for help, one rooted in responsibility, not fear. She made it clear that the situation unfolding was no longer a matter of private disagreement or internal rivalry. Something far more dangerous was taking shape, something that threatened the balance of the crown itself. At the center of her concern stood Camilla. Anne did not frame her actions as gossip or suspicion. She spoke with the gravity of someone who had seen enough to understand when a line was about to be crossed, whether through decisions already made or moves still unfolding. Camilla's actions signaled a shift that could not be ignored. The implications reached beyond personalities and power struggles. They touched the very structure of the monarchy, its future direction, and the fragile trust holding it together. What made Anne's plea all the more striking was the way it was delivered. There was no sign of weakness in her voice, no emotional unraveling. Instead, there was clarity, sharp, focused, and unsettling. She was not asking for rescue. She was sounding an alarm. To those listening, it became clear that Anne believed time was running out. If decisive action was not taken, the consequences could be irreversible. This was not how royal crises were supposed to unfold. Traditionally, conflicts were managed quietly, smoothed over by advisors, and buried beneath layers of protocol. But Anne understood that this moment demanded something different. Silence, she believed, would be a betrayal of duty. Waiting would only allow the threat to grow stronger. As word of her plea circulated among the highest levels of palace authority, the atmosphere shifted. What had once been a controlled environment of routine and tradition now felt charged with tension. Questions surfaced that no one had been prepared to answer so soon. What exactly had Camilla done? What was she planning? And why had Princess Anne, the most steadfast guardian of royal order, decided that this moment required intervention? One thing was certain. The calm image projected to the world no longer reflected the reality within palace walls. A confrontation was forming, not fueled by spectacle, but by the quiet realization that the monarchy itself was standing on uncertain ground. And with her plea, Princess Anne had thrown open the door to a conflict that could no longer be contained. So, what forced Princess Anne to break the royal code, and what secret made the crown turn against itself? Now keep watching. When the crown turned on itself, what followed Princess Anne's private warning was not the careful containment many expected. Instead, it triggered a reversal so sudden it sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the palace. Within days, quiet conversations hardened into formal steps, and whispers gave way to action. King Charles, long seen as cautious to a fault, made a move that few believed he would ever take against his own household. Behind sealed doors, a formal challenge was set in motion, one that carried legal weight, institutional force, and irreversible consequences. It was not announced publicly, nor presented as a spectacle. There were no press briefings, no official statements, no visible signs to the outside world. Yet, inside the palace, everyone understood the gravity of what was unfolding. The king had authorized a binding internal proceeding against Queen Camilla, a move that functioned as both a legal safeguard and a symbolic line in the sand. Those familiar with the matter described it not as a traditional lawsuit, but as something uniquely royal, a sealed action enforced through royal authority, supported by advisors, legal counsel, and constitutional precedent. Its purpose was not punishment, but control, an attempt to halt momentum that had begun to move beyond the king's consent. For the first time, the monarchy was being forced to confront a conflict that could no longer be managed through silence or loyalty alone. At the center of the challenge were claims that struck at the heart of trust, allegations of influence exercised too freely, decisions made without proper authority, and quiet maneuvers aimed at shaping power beyond the king's reign began to surface. None of it was framed as personal resentment. Instead, it was presented as a pattern, one that suggested boundaries had been tested and perhaps crossed. The concern was not only what had already occurred, but what might happen if those actions went unchecked. The shock was immediate and profound. A reigning king moving formally against his own queen was almost unthinkable. Royal history offered few comparisons, and none within living memory. Even seasoned palace officials struggled to process the implications. This was no domestic disagreement. It was an institutional rupture, one that risked exposing the monarchy's inner workings in ways it had always sought to avoid. For King Charles, the decision was not made lightly. Those close to him understood the personal cost involved. But the action suggested that he believed something larger was at stake: his authority, his legacy, and the future balance of the crown. By choosing a legal and procedural route, he signaled that this conflict could not be resolved through persuasion alone. Structure, documentation, and enforceable limits were now required. As news of the action spread quietly through palace corridors, tension thickened, alliances shifted, advisors measured every word. The institution that prided itself on continuity suddenly felt fragile. Princess Anne's earlier alarm now appeared not only justified, but prescient. Her plea had not been an overreaction. It had been a warning. And yet, even as the internal proceedings took shape, one truth remained unsettlingly clear. Once such a line is drawn within a monarchy, It cannot easily be erased. The king's challenge against Camilla marked a turning point, not just in their relationship, but in the very way power, loyalty, and control would be understood from that moment forward. But what happens when a king redraws loyalty itself? And which hidden name on those pages truly shattered the crown? Stay with us. The pages that rewrote loyalty. As the palace adjusted to the shock of King Charles's sealed challenge, attention slowly turned to a quieter, more unsettling origin point. Long before formal actions were authorized and boundaries enforced, there had been a period marked by reflection and doubt. In the final months leading up to the internal proceedings, those closest to the king noticed a change in his rhythm. Meetings ran longer, questions grew sharper. Familiar assurances no longer seemed to satisfy him. Something had begun to trouble him deeply. And it was not the noise outside the palace walls, but what he was seeing from within. At the heart of this unease was a handwritten letter, unassuming in appearance, yet devastating in implication. Written in King Charles's own hand during a period of private withdrawal, the letter was never meant for public eyes. It was a record, carefully worded and deliberately preserved, outlining concerns that could not be spoken aloud without consequence. Within its pages were reflections on authority, loyalty, and influence, and a clear acknowledgement that trust inside the household was no longer intact. The letter detailed a pattern that had become impossible to ignore. It referenced decisions made without consultation, private channels of communication operating beyond approved structures, and subtle efforts to shape post-reign arrangements without the king's consent. What made these revelations so implicating was not their tone measured and restrained, but their specificity. Dates were noted, meetings were referenced, conversations were recalled with precision. This was not suspicion, it was documentation. Understanding the gravity of what he had written, King Charles entrusted the letter to Princess Anne. The choice was deliberate. Anne was not a political operator, nor someone driven by ambition. She was, above all else, a custodian of duty. By placing the letter in her care, the king was not seeking an ally in conflict, but a guardian of truth. Anne was instructed to protect it, not to use it, unless the moment came when silence itself would become a betrayal. That moment arrived sooner than expected as internal tensions escalated and Camilla's influence continued to expand unchecked. The letter transformed from a private reflection into a cornerstone of action. Its contents provided both the moral and legal foundation for the challenge that followed. It clarified intent. It established the cause. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the king's decision was not sudden or impulsive, but the result of prolonged concern and careful consideration. For Princess Anne, the weight of the letter was immense. She understood that releasing its contents, even within controlled institutional channels, would permanently alter relationships within the royal household. Yet withholding it would allow the very issues it described to deepen. Her role was never about choosing sides. It was about ensuring that the truth once written could not be erased by convenience or fear. As the letter was quietly introduced into the internal process, its impact was immediate. Advisors who had dismissed earlier warnings now fell silent. Legal teams shifted their posture. The narrative changed. What had seemed like an internal power struggle was reframed as a documented breach of trust, anchored by the king's own words. And while the palace continued to project calm, those who had seen the letter understood its significance. It was not merely evidence of conflict. It was proof that the crisis threatening the crown had been recognized long before it surfaced, and that the steps now unfolding were the consequence of a truth too implicating to ignore. And now that the letter resurfaces, who truly anticipated the collapse? And which hidden hands steered the crown toward it? Stay glued. Ambition, access, and the quiet drift of power. With the letter now circulating among a tightly controlled circle, attention naturally shifted to the figure whose growing influence had prompted such grave concern. Camilla's rise within the royal structure had never been accidental. Nor had it been sudden. It was the result of patience, calculation, and an acute understanding of how power truly operates behind palace walls. For years, she moved carefully, mastering the rhythms of royal life, learning when to speak and when silence carried more weight. To many, this discipline was admirable. To others, it was strategic from the outset. Camilla demonstrated a political sophistication that set her apart. She cultivated relationships quietly, positioning herself as a stabilizing presence during moments of uncertainty. Advisors found her approachable. Courtiers respected her awareness of protocol. Over time, her access expanded not just to people, but to processes. What began as support gradually evolved into influence. And influence, when left unchecked, has a way of reshaping boundaries. The shift did not happen in open defiance of King Charles's vision. In fact, much of it unfolded parallel to it, making it harder to detect. Decisions were framed as helpful. Suggestions were offered as solutions. Yet, beneath the surface, a subtle divergence was taking shape, where the king emphasized continuity and restraint. Camilla increasingly pushed toward consolidation and permanence. The monarchy, in her view, needed to be secured against uncertainty, even if that meant redrawing lines that had long been respected. This was where confidence began to edge into overreach. Camilla's growing independence from established structures did not announce itself with confrontation. Instead, it appeared in the form of bypassed consultations, private discussions held outside traditional channels, and an expanding role in shaping conversations about the future, particularly those extending beyond the king's active reign. To some, these actions looked like initiative. To others, especially those tasked with protecting institutional balance, they raised alarms. What complicated matters further was Camilla's belief that her actions served the monarchy's best interests. She did not see herself as undermining authority, but reinforcing it in a changing world. This conviction made it difficult for her to challenge. When questioned, she defended her choices with logic and loyalty, insisting that her intentions aligned with stability. And yet, intentions alone could not erase the implications of acting without mandate. Princess Anne, observing this evolution from a distance, recognized the danger not in ambition itself, but in its direction. The monarchy had survived centuries precisely because no single figure was allowed to accumulate unchecked control. Camilla's trajectory, however, suggested a growing comfort with operating beyond those limits. It was this pattern documented, measured, and increasingly visible that lent credibility to the betrayal claims now under review. Importantly, no one inside the process framed Camilla as a villain. The issue was not malice, but momentum. Power, once gained, tends to justify itself. Each step forward made the next feel necessary. Each exception weakened the rule. And as her influence expanded, the gap between Camilla's vision and the monarchy's long-term interests widened just enough to become dangerous. By the time the internal challenge took shape, the question was no longer whether Camilla had crossed a line, but how far she was willing to go. The evidence did not point to a single act of betrayal, but to a gradual drift, one that, left uncorrected, threatened to redefine who truly held control at the heart of the crown. So what now? As Anne seeks rescue, Charles escalates legally, and Camilla's silence deepens, hiding truths powerful enough to shatter everything. The weight of silence she could no longer carry. For Princess Anne, the conflict had never been abstract. It lived with her daily, pressing heavier with each passing week. Long before the palace corridors filled with tension and guarded conversations, she had been carrying something far more burdensome than responsibility alone. She was carrying King Charles's trust quietly given, deliberately placed, and impossible to set aside. It was not a title or a public role, but a private obligation that demanded judgment, courage, and restraint in equal measure. Anne had always understood the cost of loyalty. Throughout her life, she had chosen duty over comfort, discretion over recognition. But this moment tested her in a way no ceremonial obligation ever had. She was watching the balance of power inside the monarchy shift in real time, and she was one of the few who could see how fragile that balance had become. Each new development confirmed what she had feared. Camilla's influence was no longer merely growing, it was consolidating. Resistance met Anne at every turn. Some dismissed her concerns as caution taken too far. Others urged patience, arguing that intervention would only deepen divisions. The unspoken message was clear. Maintaining the appearance of unity mattered more than addressing the cracks beneath it. For Anne, that logic was dangerously short-sighted. She had seen what happened when problems were buried instead of confronted. History had taught her that silence, when chosen for convenience, often became complicity. What weighed on her most was not conflict, but isolation. She knew that speaking out, even privately, would place her in direct opposition to powerful interests within the palace. It would strain relationships she had spent decades protecting. Yet, doing nothing would mean allowing decisions to unfold that she believed King Charles himself would never have sanctioned. The letter in her care was a constant reminder of that truth. Every time she revisited its words, the responsibility grew heavier. This was the point at which her plea for help took on its full meaning. It was no longer just an institutional warning or a procedural concern. It was personal. Anne was not asking for support to protect her own position. She was asking for reinforcement because she could no longer bear the consequences of standing alone between truth and silence. The emotional gravity of that moment came not from fear, but from clarity. She understood exactly what was at stake. Anne began to realize that restraint, once her greatest strength, had become a liability. The same discipline that had kept her steady for decades now risked enabling a slow erosion of the monarchy's foundations. Camilla's consolidation of control was not dramatic enough to spark public alarm, but it was steady enough to reshape outcomes. Each quiet success made the next easier. Each unchecked move narrowed the space for correction. In confronting this reality, Anne reached her breaking point not through collapse, but through resolve. She accepted that remaining silent would be the true betrayal, not of any individual, but of the institution she had sworn to protect. Her duty was not to comfort power, but to challenge it when necessary. That realization marked a shift within her, transforming concern into action. As she stepped fully into this role, Anne ceased to be merely an observer of the crisis. She became its moral center, the one willing to bear the strain of confrontation so that the monarchy might still have a chance to correct its course. And with that decision, the conflict moved beyond quiet unease into something far more consequential, setting the stage for forces within the palace to finally collide. But what happens when Anne's moral stand threatens buried secrets, and the palace fights back to protect power itself? Stay tuned. Fractures of power. The palace, once a symbol of seamless tradition and unwavering hierarchy, now felt like a maze of tension and quiet urgency. In every grand hallway and ornate chamber, whispers of alliances, doubts, and strategy cut through the usual air of ceremony. What had always been an image of unity, the carefully choreographed appearances, the rituals passed down for centuries, was now showing cracks. Some subtle, others impossible to ignore. The very walls seemed to sense the turmoil, echoing the hurried footsteps of aides, lawyers, and senior officials rushing between rooms with documents clutched tightly in hand. Camilla, keenly aware of the stakes, moved swiftly to shape the narrative in her favor. Her team circulated statements designed to cast doubt on the legitimacy of Princess Anne's challenge. painting it as a personal grievance rather than a formal claim. Every word, every timing of disclosure, seemed calculated to sway opinion before Anne could respond. Yet Anne, precise and unyielding, was ready. She brought with her meticulously organized records, letters, meeting notes, and accounts from trusted witnesses that traced every step and every claim with chronological clarity. Each piece was a small but potent argument, a counter to the insinuations Camilla and her advisors were attempting to seed. The tension was strategic and unrelenting. Legal teams huddled over tables scattered with papers, analyzing every precedent, every potential loophole. Advisors whispered into their ears, offering counsel that ranged from cautious to bold. Senior palace figures, those who once moved with authority and certainty, now navigated a labyrinth of shifting loyalties, their decisions carrying consequences far beyond the immediate dispute. No one could afford a misstep. In this arena, tradition alone no longer held sway. Anne's approach was as much about timing as it was about substance. She presented evidence in careful stages, anticipating each attempt at discrediting her, knowing when to release details and when to hold back. Witnesses, loyal, credible, and observant, stood ready to affirm the integrity of her documentation. Every interaction, every clarification served to underline a simple but powerful point. The monarchy was no longer merely about protocol. It was about survival, about ensuring that truth and authority remained aligned even in the most challenging circumstances. As the palace shifted from ceremony to crisis, the atmosphere grew charged with an intensity that could be felt even by those on the periphery. Corridors that had once echoed with soft laughter now carried the weight of strategic deliberation and silent calculation. The stakes had been raised beyond reputation, beyond image. They now involved the very structure of influence within the royal household. Every move, every revelation, every challenge reshaped alliances and tested loyalty, pushing the monarchy into uncharted territory. In this crucible, every gesture carried meaning, every decision had impact, and every moment could tilt the balance. The palace was no longer a sanctuary of tradition. It had become a battlefield where clarity, strategy, and courage would determine the future. Anne's determination, Camilla's maneuvers, and the cautious yet decisive actions of the palace's inner circle converged into a tense, unpredictable struggle, one where the outcomes were far from certain, and every observer understood that history was being written in real time. Now what happens when Anne pushes forward? Camilla counters quietly, and one unseen decision decides the monarchy's fate alone. The monarchy in the balance. The courtroom was heavy with more than just the formalities of law. It carried the weight of history itself. Every glance, every carefully chosen word seemed amplified, echoing far beyond the polished floors and ornate walls. The conflict had evolved. It was no longer a matter of Camilla defending herself or Princess Anne asserting her challenge. This was a reckoning, a test of the monarchy's ability to confront its own truths, to examine where loyalty had faltered and whether the institution could protect not just titles, but the integrity of its legacy. King Charles sat with measured authority, but even he could not hide the strain. The documents presented, the witnesses called, and the questions raised were not merely about personal grievance. They struck at the very mechanisms of power, at how decisions had been made, and whose voices had been heard or ignored. Princess Anne, composed yet undeniably determined, presented each piece of evidence with deliberate clarity. Letters carefully dated and annotated revealed patterns that spoke as loudly as any testimony. Witnesses recounted events with meticulous precision, their words painting a picture of timing, intent, and accountability. The atmosphere in the room shifted with every revelation. Legal teams debated quietly in hushed tones, their strategies unfolding with the precision of chess moves, anticipating each counter-move. Each line of questioning, senior officials and advisors, once secure in their influence, now found themselves navigating a minefield of precedent, public perception, and family loyalty. Every gesture, every pause carried meaning, as if the eyes of the nation itself were focused on each moment, weighing every word and inflection. What became clear even in these early stages was that this case was more than a legal challenge. It was a mirror held up to the monarchy itself. The questions it raised were larger than any single person. Who truly controlled the legacy of the crown? Could loyalty be measured by obedience alone, or did it require transparency, fairness, and accountability? Was the institution capable of recognizing its own missteps and correcting them? Or would it cling to image at the cost of truth? These were not rhetorical musings. They were the very stakes being decided in real time under the intense scrutiny of history, media, and public expectation. Even as the legal arguments unfolded, the symbolism of the moment was impossible to ignore. This was a monarchy judging itself, a family's private struggles transformed into a public examination of values, responsibility, and trust. Every objection, every ruling, and every statement made was layered with significance far beyond the immediate conflict. The palace, once a sanctuary of unspoken hierarchy and tradition, had become a forum for reflection, a testing ground where the survival of respect and legitimacy depended on clarity, courage, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. In that charged atmosphere, it was no longer possible to separate the personal from the institutional. Camilla's defenses and Anne's challenge, while central to the proceedings, were merely conduits through which deeper questions about the monarchy's identity, resilience, and moral authority were being asked. Each day of testimony, each carefully scrutinized piece of evidence, carried with it the quiet but undeniable message. The outcome of this trial would be remembered not only for its verdict, but for what it revealed about a centuries-old institution forced to confront itself. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this unfolding royal drama. If you find value in deep analysis that goes beyond headlines and dares to question what happens behind palace walls, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more exclusive stories. Your voice matters here. Share your thoughts in the comments, because every perspective adds another layer to this conversation. And most importantly, stay curious. Because in the world of royalty, the truth is rarely what it first appears to be.